I knew something was wrong the moment I saw the woman in the white blazer holding my newborn like she'd just confiscated contraband. It didn't look real, this HOA president standing in my wife's hospital room, rocking my daughter and telling me she was a Category 2 occupancy violation. And when she said she'd be returned after the board reviewed our retention request, every instinct in me, every old reflex I thought I'd retired, snapped back like a loaded wire. My name is Thorne Velrich, 17 years as a Navy SEAL, logistics and containment specialist. I've entered hostile zones quieter than a breath. I've carried men out of burning compounds. I've overridden lockdown systems mid-crisis. But nothing prepared me for watching an HOA president walk into a secure maternity wing and lift my daughter out of a bassinet as if she were seizing an unauthorized shed. I remember the hiss of the emergency access door behind me, the way Eloise Tarrant tilted her chin at me like I'd interrupted her paperwork. She wore a crimson lanyard that didn't belong to her clipped to a badge she forged carrying an authority she invented. My wife, Risa, lay paralyzed by IV lines and exhaustion, too weak to protest. She couldn't speak, just stared at me with wide, terrified eyes as her daughter. Our daughter was held by a woman who treated babies like line items on a spreadsheet. I told her quietly, "Put her down." She raised an eyebrow. "She'll be returned once the board reviews your request for retention." Retention? Like my child was office equipment. I didn't yell, didn't posture. I knew the hospital's AI was recording everything. I knew every second she held my daughter was being logged. And I knew that once I had timestamps logs footage, her world would collapse under the weight of her own arrogance. But in that moment, anger couldn't help me. I just wanted my daughter back in my wife's arms. When I lifted the baby, when I placed her against Risa's chest, and my wife sobbed without making a sound, I realized I had just crossed an invisible line. Eloise thought she was untouchable. She thought she could walk into a restricted medical wing, wave a fake title around, and rewrite the definition of authority because nobody ever stopped her. She had no idea I wasn't just another neighbor. That night at home, the HOA letter was waiting for me. Gold ink, official seal. A violation titled Unauthorized Residential Expansion listing my newborn daughter's name. They time-stamped it before she was born, before she took her first breath, before anyone could possibly know she existed. That was when everything inside me, every disciplined instinct, every tactical habit shifted from defend to dismantle. I walked outside into the humid 2 a.m. air and studied the street camera mounted on the pole. It turned toward me. Of course it did. Wickerdale Edge didn't monitor residents for safety. It monitored them for deviation. And nothing deviated more in Eloise's eyes than a family she couldn't control. By morning, the HOA portal showed a compliance hearing scheduled in 3 days. Mandatory. If I didn't attend, they'd escalate to fines, liens, even forced relocation. For a newborn. I didn't storm the HOA office. That's what Eloise expected. People like her survive off confrontation. They twist it into narrative. Instead, I went back to the hospital and walked into the chapel, where Sister Corvell Nave sat alone, her hands shaking, eyes red from a night of replaying what she saw. She wasn't praying. She was breaking. And when she told me Eloise had carried a laminated form with made-up seals, using a non-existent municipal liaison title to bluff her way through the nurses, I finally understood the depth of the rot. Then she handed me something that would change everything. A slip of paper. A copy of the internal incident log before it was purged. That was my first real proof. But proof wasn't enough. Not with Wickerdale. That HOA didn't operate like a community, it operated like a regime wrapped in landscaping brochures. Every rule had a loophole. Every loophole was a trap, and every trap existed to keep people compliant. Still, I wasn't ready to go nuclear. Not yet. Not until I understood exactly what kind of machine I was fighting. But the machine didn't wait. The next morning, a new notice appeared. Environmental burden assessment claiming our household exceeded sustainability limits, citing our 6-pound infant as an ecological stressor. When Eloise herself rode in on a county inspector's golf cart and tried to enter my home without consent, smiling like she was conducting a wellness check, I knew this wasn't about policy. It was about domination. I told them they had no signed order, no notice, no right. The inspector hesitated. Eloise didn't. She simply said, "We'll be back." Good, I thought, because next time I'd be ready. But readiness didn't stop the collapse I felt that night. There was a point, one I'm not proud of, where I sat on the edge of the bed watching my daughter breathe through a faint wheeze, watching my wife stare at the ceiling like she was afraid to blink. And I wondered if I was the problem, if resisting was making it worse, if maybe, just maybe, things would quiet down if I simply signed the forms, attended the hearing, played along. That's the kind of exhaustion people like Eloise depend on. Not fear, not ignorance. Exhaustion. I almost gave in. But then I remembered Risa frozen on that hospital bed while Eloise bent over her newborn, our newborn, with a smile. And something inside me snapped back into place. Steady, cold, focused. I opened my laptop and started building a war. First, I pulled the hospital's access logs from a back-end system I'd worked on years earlier. Julia's ID had been used twice, once in an admin office on another floor, once at the secure maternity door. Eloise didn't have clearance. She used borrowed credentials. She fabricated a government title. She walked into a locked medical wing without legal authority. And the hospital had already scrubbed her name. But not the footprints. You can't erase everything. You can only hope nobody knows where to look. And I knew exactly where to look. By dawn, I had timestamps, badge scans, footage, and a digital trail so tight it was practically a noose. I didn't take it to the HOA. I didn't take it to the community board. I sent it to the Virginia Office of Civil Enforcement and to the one investigator I trusted to understand what systemic coercion looked like. 2 hours later, Alan Voss replied, "We'll take this, but we'll do it by the book. You'll need to be on record." I said yes. I didn't care what it required. The next big wave came at the HOA hearing. The room was staged like a courtroom, rows of chairs. Board members lined up at a long table, Eloise in the center with a binder full of policy jargon and a face full of confidence. She welcomed me with that same tight smile, as if she already knew she'd win. "Do you have documentation to present?" she asked. I placed the first photo on the table, Eloise entering the hospital hallway. No badge, time stamped. Her fingers hesitated. For the first time, she blinked. The hearing ended without a vote. Procedural continuation, she called it. That meant she was scared not of me, but of what I was holding. That same afternoon, she escalated with another notice: mandatory environmental harmony inspection. They wanted inside my home legally, officially, with forms and witnesses. But what she didn't know was that the state had already opened a Title 17 investigation behind her back. Requests for documents were already landing in Wickerdale's inbox. The hospital was already placing Julia on administrative leave. The HOA couldn't enforce anything without risking obstruction charges. But Eloise, drunk on her own power, pressed harder. So I did something she never expected. I went quiet. I requested data transparency under state administrative law, forcing the HOA to hand over every internal communication about me. I documented every camera rotation. I gathered every violation since we moved in, all 8 of them, each more ridiculous than the last. I contacted neighbors' families who'd been fined for oxygen tanks, for autism meltdowns, for keeping a railing up during grief. And then I waited. The fuse was lit. When the next board meeting came, the room was packed, standing room only. Residents who normally stayed home showed up in silence, phones out, eyes forward. Eloise started with a slideshow about demographic stability, using big words to dress up her abuse. And then she introduced a new amendment, 12A4, designed to legalize what she'd done to my newborn. That was her fatal mistake. I walked to the front without being invited. I laid out everything: photos, logs, forged credentials, the hidden medical privacy clause from the HOA contract. I spoke clearly, calmly, but every line hit like a hammer. "This isn't about policy," I told the room. "My daughter is not a violation. She's not an ecological burden. She's a human being. And this woman walked into a restricted medical unit using a title that doesn't exist." The room shifted. You could feel it, air-tightening shoulders, lifting spines, straightening. Then Carla Stem, a widow from Lot 12, stood and said the sentence that cracked Eloise's entire facade. "This is accountability." Phones went up. People started talking. The board members looked at one another, unsure who they were supposed to follow now. Eloise tried to regain control, snapping that this was grandstanding, but nobody listened. Not one person. And just like that, her power dissolved. Not with a bang, but with abandonment. That night, a portal message went out. President Eloise Tarand is recusing herself from enforcement operations pending administrative review. No apology, no explanation, just retreat. The next morning, the state investigation went public. Findings confirmed misconduct, falsified authority, unauthorized access. Neighbors began emailing me, telling me stories they'd never dared share. Someone slipped a copy of our original HOA contract into my mailbox anonymous. It contained a clause proving the board had violated their own rules the second Eloise touched my daughter. Within days, the HOA suspended every violation against my family. Julia resigned. Residents organized their own meeting one without the board's control. They were planning a leadership overhaul. A vote. The system Eloise built was collapsing its nails, rusting its walls, bowing under the weight of a truth she couldn't rewrite. And me, I didn't celebrate, didn't cheer, didn't feel victorious. I just stepped onto my porch, watched the HOA camera across the street sit perfectly still, and breathed a full breath for the first time since the night my daughter was born. And that's when I understood the lesson I should have known from the start. When someone abuses power long enough, they forget what real authority looks like, until it's standing right in front of them.